What is your stance on reparations?
Yes.
I understand the moral argument for reparations. I think race-based reparations are very, very obviously unconstitutional under the recent Supreme Court decision in the Harvard case. So my approach to economic development in Black communities, I think, is more comprehensive than that, and less and constitutional. I've worked for 35 years as on the board of directors of Bedford-Stuyvesant Restoration, which is the oldest community development corporation. My father started it in our country in one of the poorest Black neighborhoods in America. And I watched what economic development could do to those neighborhoods. One of the problems in Black neighborhoods is that there is no equity, and we have systematically stripped equity, including namely home ownership, from Black neighborhoods. By 2030, there will be essentially zero Black equity left in this country. And that's destroying these neighborhoods. If you don't own a home, if you don't own something that you can borrow money on, you have no entree to American capitalism. You are no longer a citizen. You are now a subject. And the challenge is, those communities are redlined. It was Black communities. The entire nation, collapsed. Our real estate collapsed in 2008 because of these balloon mortgages and these exotic instruments. Well, those companies were testing those exotic instruments for a decade earlier in Black people. That was the testing zone. And those, Bed-Stuy, when I started working there, was the reason my father chose that neighborhood is it was very poor, but it had a high incident of home ownership by Black families, many who've been there from the Civil War. And so they had the opportunity to start businesses, and they were very entrepreneurial. The problem is they were redlined, and my father ended that and got them access to capital. And the other problem with Black businesses is that a lot of, there's not the accrued knowledge, business knowledge in Black communities. Like my father always said, if he wanted to start a business, he'd call a friend of his from Harvard, the Harvard Business School, and say, how do you solve this problem? How do you do this accounting issue? How do you handle inventories? When do you pay for the inventories, et cetera? In a Black neighborhood, there is not that accrued knowledge, and people can't pick up the phone and get it. So one of the things we did with Bed-Stuy is we made those mentorships available to them. And when we first started working in Bed-Stuy, Fulton Street in Brooklyn, there wasn't a single open business. They were all boarded up. Today, it's a thriving community with Black-owned businesses everywhere. And the other thing we need to be doing in those communities is it's criminal what we're doing to schools, urban schools in this country. Kids are not getting educated. They're being warehoused in those schools. And what I see people teaching about for diversity training and all of these sort of anti-racism education and enforcement, et cetera, which is all great. But that's not going to solve the problem. What solves the problem, if you have a generation of kids who have self-confidence, who believe in themselves, who have access to capital, who are part of families that are building businesses, who own a business for themselves. I was called, when I was a kid, there was a lot of anti-Catholic prejudice in this country, and I got called names like mackerel snatcher, et cetera. And it never bothered me. I would think, it's that person's problem. They're calling me that. I'm proud of who I am. I'm proud of my religion. And, I was able to feel that way.
So, Mr. Kennedy, not to cut you off, but just, I just wanted to go, because you said, so I think we did two different conversations as far as Black economic empowerment. That's important. That's kind of the basis of our whole show. But the question was specifically around reparations. So you said, you're anti that, and you said that, I believe you said it's unconstitutional. But were Japanese Americans not compensated for what happened to them during World War II?
Yeah, Japanese Americans were compensated. And I think if reparations were not race-based, for example, if you just said, no matter what race you are, if you can trace your lineage back to slavery, you could not do reparations for Jim Crow. You can make a very strong moral case for that, and I grew up in a Jim Crow state, but you can't do race-based. You could say, okay, if I trace my lineage back to slavery and my family was promised 40 acres and a mule, and then we got double crossed on that, you could conceivably bring that case, and that it would be that would pass constitutional muster. Do I think that that case politically that you could push through those kind of reparations in Congress? I think it would be a very, very heavy lift.
So you brought up a few issues, right? You talked about the lack of education in our community, the lack of schools, which hence talks about the lack of education. You talked about the lack of businesses in our communities. You said the issues with having no home equity. And these are all issues, redlining you brought up. But I want to talk about something that also plagues our communities, and that's criminal justice and mass incarceration and criminal justice reform. So I want to know what your thoughts are around that, because as we know, Black, African Americans, and Latinx community are disproportionately incarcerated, more so than anybody in our country and pretty much the world for that matter. So what are your thoughts around criminal justice reform?
Well, I think the 1986 Criminal Justice Act, and then 1994, which incidentally were both supported by, or written, both of them by President Biden, were probably the worst blight on the African American community. And as you guys know, there was 100 to 1. In the 1986 Act, there was 100 to 1 penalty for crack cocaine vis-a-vis powder cocaine. And crack cocaine was a black drug. They're both cocaine. They're both the same drug, but the form was more common. Crack was more common in Black communities. So the penalties that were assigned to it were 100 times. So a kid who was in a Black community that got caught with some crack got 100 times the penalty of a kid in a white community a mile away that had powder cocaine. And in the years between, in the 8 years after that, the 86 Act, with the 94 Act, well, let's say this, by 1998, the Black population in America's prisons had doubled. And they were for mainly nonviolent crimes. It was for drug crimes. And we destroyed an entire generation of Black Americans. We made it in many states so they can't vote. They're disenfranchised. There was a generation of Black children who were raised without their fathers. And, there was, that's where rap music came from. All of these, the entire culture of the Black community, because prison was so commonplace, became part of the typical cultural experience.
I'm sorry. Are you saying that
for a country? No, to answer your question, I want to stop.
Yeah, I just wanted to be clear what you were saying about the music itself. You're saying that the music derived from the mass incarceration, or because I just want to be clear.
Mass incarceration dictated the way people dress, the music. All I'm saying is it was such a powerful and universal experience that it put the stamp on every aspect of Black culture. And it's, I don't think I'm not saying anything. I'm certainly not saying anything against rap music. I'm just saying that it changed it altered the entire culture. And it's not it's not a good thing. It was not a good thing for our country. It was definitely not a good thing for the Black population or for economic development or people being able to live in this country and fulfill their potential and fulfill their expectations. And prison's not a good place to do that. So, that's all I was saying. And as president, I'm going to, do everything I can to make sure. My father fought, tooth and nail for prison reform, to make sure that people, when they came out of prison, that they had training, that they had opportunities for education, that they had opportunities when they got out, and that people weren't in prison for for crimes that they shouldn't be in prison for. When my father died, all of the inmates at Sing Sing and Attica wore black armbands because the commitment he'd made to better the conditions in the prisons and to give opportunities to people, that they're not castaways. What I want to do is start invent, but prisons are now the biggest industry in rural areas in our country. And I want to develop instead a string of farm drug rehabs and healing farms in those same rural communities where people can go if they get involved with drugs, if they're debilitated by depression or dependence on psychiatric drugs that they want to get off of. There's places for them to go where they can learn to live in communities again, where they can receive job training, where they can receive get social skills and make sure they can get GEDs and education or whatever, and that we have a humane way of treating people in this country who've gone off on the wrong tack. Listen, I was a drug addict for 14 years when I was a kid after my dad died. And, if I had been in a Black community, I'd probably be in prison today. So, that's not fair and it's not a good thing for our country. And, I don't, it's going to be one of my priorities as president.
But the issue is systemic, right? We can all agree on that. And we all know from the statistics that it hasn't been a place to rehabilitate people. But from a business standpoint, the more prisoners that are taken in, the cost for it is tremendous. So private prison specifically, what is the benefit of not imprisoning our population? Like, what are we going to do to combat that if you're elected?
Well, let me ask you something. Besides what I said, what do you think I should be doing?
What do I think you should be doing?
What do you think? Tell me what, if you were president, or if I'm president, and I call you up on the first week and say, will you come up here and give me a plan for prison reform? What are you going to tell me to do?
I don't think it's a singular proposal, right? I think that's something that we'd have to discuss amongst our people from a place that's educated.
Now you sound like a politician.
No, I'm sounding like somebody that's answering your question, right? From a standpoint that we know the issues and we know the people that benefit from it, but every time somebody is, trying to be elected for an office or a seat, they talk about policies, but none of them are ever implemented. And so I'm asking you specifically, what are the policies, right? Are there educational programs? Is it police reform, or are we having better training? Like, what are the specific things that are going to be implemented to combat it?
Well, I have a guy who's working on my campaign who served a long bid in prison, and he got his GED in there, he got an education, and he came out feeling like it actually had been a positive experience for him. And so I think it's possible that when people go to particularly when young people go to prison, we give them opportunities to actually make themselves better for when they get out of prison. And, you know, I've been in prison. I served, I spent the summer of 2001 in maximum security federal prison in Puerto Rico. And, you know, in that particular prison, there were a lot of educational opportunities for people, and there were other opportunities. And then there were things that were foreclosed. Like I couldn't go to AA meetings when I was in that prison. There's something wrong with that. A lot of people are in prison. You want to have access to recovery. So I know I could tell you right now that, you know, when I'm president, I'm going to make sure that federal prisoners have access to 12-step programs. If somebody wants to recover, that's a perfect place to do it. But you know what I'm also asking you, and I'm going to provide educational opportunities and make sure that, you know, that we do everything that we can to identify model programs around the country that are working, and then try to adopt those protocols in other prisons. And that's all I can tell you. But I mean, I'd love to hear, because a lot of people ask me about prison reform.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, when I say to them, and I said this to my friend Champ, I said, what would you do with you or me? And he said, education changed my life. So that's a good idea. I want that available to everybody. And if you have an idea, and I want to hear it, you know, because I don't know everything.
I think first and
areas that I
foremost,
know a lot about. You know, and
if we're going to be very honest, we're going to have to find a way to offset the $7.4 billion that they lose annually. So if there is cash and money related incentives to lock our people up, there has to be a way to funnel them from the current system that they're using into another.